Okay, everyone. Welcome to week 10, British and American culture classes. I know midterms just ended. We had an early holiday and stuff, so things are happening quickly. On Friday, we have a quiz, including today's lecture. So make sure you look at last week's sort of introduction to the Americas, the age of exploration, and the New World and how things worked in the 16th century away from British culture. We had a pretty long and detailed lecture on Friday, so I hope you took good notes there too. The chapter itself, the good news is the chapter itself isn't that long, and hopefully it won't take me too much longer to wrap up this chapter because I don't really want you to be overloaded by the first quiz when you come back. We won't have a quiz next week, so it'll be 2 weeks. So there'll be a lot of material on the last quiz though. So consider this one, one of the easier quizzes. So just pay attention, try and get a good score on this one because it's not really that long. A lot of the stuff I said in the previous video lecture and on Friday are not in the textbooks, so watch out for that, okay? There'll be a few things today too that I mentioned, but I'll start out with stuff that's right in the textbook, which you can review yourself. The people, the generation of Americans that organized the rebellion, as I told you on Friday, it wasn't a revolution in the beginning. I mistakenly wrote the wrong dates on the board, but the second, the Treaty of Paris and the 7 Years' War between the French and the English, the British, now they're the British, including Scotland and their territories. They had a war which lasted over 7 years, and the British won, the main consequence of which was that the peace treaty handed over New France, which would become the province of Quebec and be a part of the country of Canada, where I'm from. I lived in Montreal for 4 years, and I think Quebec is a beautiful place to live in, and the culture is unique, and Canada wouldn't be the same without it. But I can't go into detail about that. Ask me about that another time outside of class, okay? But that is what happened in that war. In North America, it's called the French and Indian War. If you come across that name, that's just the theater. That's just the North American part. They fought in the Caribbean and they fought in Asia, in India primarily. They fought near Africa. They fought on the oceans and then on land in Europe. It was an intercontinental war. It was essentially a world war, although the British won, it cost both countries a lot. So I went into that salutary neglect. The word I was trying to remember, which I finally got by the end of the lecture. I'll stick it somewhere. I know there's a bit of a glare here. I hope you can see. But the best place to put this is probably somewhere at the top. I'll put it over here though. I guess you guys can see this part. You don't have to remember this special name, but I think it's a great expression, salutary neglect. Salutary actually means like something, an unexpected kind of benefit from something good. So like what I explained to you was by ignoring the colonies and not helping them, they were kind of giving them their independence and doing something good. So this is how the British described this policy of making these colonies, but not supporting them financially, but also not taxing them very much and not making them follow the rules, right? There was a lot of smuggling. There was a lot of, well, I guess you could call it criminal behavior according to what the laws were in Britain. But they largely allowed the individual colonies to govern themselves. So it wasn't like the Crown was telling North Carolina what to do all the time. Neither were they doing it to Massachusetts or New York or New Jersey or Georgia or any of the other 13 states. I won't name them all because that's too much history for you guys too. I heard from a Chungnam student ages ago that this is an exam from probably 25 years ago, but the final exam was just memorizing the entire 50 states of America. I don't think that's a good way to test students' knowledge of American culture. No offense to that professor, whoever he was, but it was a Chungnan professor apparently. So you don't have to memorize all the states, but you all know the big ones. You all know New Jersey and Massachusetts, and you know, and they all have different characters. All right, that's important to remember. Religious freedom is part of the reason that a lot of these people leave. I told you, one reason could be because you're poor. One reason could be because you're Irish and you're starving, and there's not enough. You're overpopulated. Perhaps you are in the military. Perhaps you are homeless, or maybe you worked. You know, maybe you were on a ship. The British Navy needed thousands and thousands of people to work on the ships, and most people did not want to live on a ship for years. It was not a fun job, and you could easily get killed, get sick, or sink in the ocean. So there's many reasons that people who are not upper class, not wealthy, not privileged, not educated, made their way to North America, right? Made their way to New England and took a chance. Even though New England was no picnic, as I explained. Lots of native people didn't want them there for good reason. So you could end up fighting with native tribes. You could end up getting sick there. It's much colder. The climate in New England is much colder and harsher than England is. There's wild animals. Like I said before, there's not really police officers or laws being enforced. So, you know, you took your chances. The land of opportunity had opportunities, but it also had huge risks, which involves possible death by many different ways. But if you're starving or dying or being sent to a workhouse, or you're a criminal in England, you might prefer to leave and take your chances in the colonies. So that's what a lot of people did. So over 140 years or so, this is the way it was until the British defeated the French in North America, essentially, except for, I told you, Saint-Domingue, which will become the country of Haiti, where they decided to keep their land because it was it made so much money from sugar. Sugar was so expensive, and so Saint-Domingue was actually financially worth a lot more to the French. So at the time it made sense. Obviously, right now Quebec is worth a lot more than Haiti is, but this is 250 years ago. The global economy was different, and that island was worth too much money for the French to give up. So essentially, from Florida north was just the British. They had no competition. So they wanted to balance their budget. They had borrowed heavily. The government was almost bankrupt. So they did what I asked on Friday. What do you think they did? Well, they taxed people. And everybody hates the word taxes already, and you saw what happened in the English Civil War. So they call them acts. They call them acts. The Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, right? These things. These were kind of motions, not like an income tax. Like whatever you make, we're going to take 10% of what you make every year. Remember the Peasants' Revolt in 1381. The tax that Richard II imposed on his subject was a poll tax. And a poll tax means that everybody pays a flat rate, which I think that, I'm not sure which kind of, I've never had to pay a tax like that, but I personally, I would think that would be maybe one of the most infuriating taxes. If you had to pay a tax, would you rather pay a sales tax, right? When you bought, right? When you bought some, let's say, apples, there was a tax on apples, a fruit tax. Would you rather pay a fruit tax? Would you rather pay an income tax? So 20% of whatever money you make from your job is taken away. Or would you rather pay, the government just says, give me 10% of all of your money that you have, all your wealth. Your you're worth $10,000. Give me $1,000. That sounds like the type of tax which would make people start a revolution. So no wonder the Peasants' Revolt happened, right? That's a pretty brutal tax, just to say everybody, no matter how rich or poor you are, everybody's paying $1,000. It wasn't even a percentage. I digress though, but we've established in this class the things that are going to push people to the edge are death and taxes, right? The Black Death made people demand more, right? They knew they were going to die anyway, so they wanted more out of their life. Makes sense, especially being paid more and being able to have a little bit of happiness, at least live with your family or have a chance to improve your life and not be a virtual slave your whole life. This all makes sense. So the British subjects, they're not American yet. The British subjects feel like living in America, they've worked hard and they've created these societies that are actually kind of supposed to be copies. Like Boston will be remarkably like, a city in England. And the best thing about going to Montreal, to me, is you go to old Montreal, sorry, this is Canada, but you go to old Montreal and there's a part of Montreal that it feels like you're walking down the street in a French city. And like the food is French and people are speaking French. It's because the French who moved to Canada tried to create, French streets, buildings, culture, design their cities to imitate the mother country. So Boston, like on the eve of the revolution, the reason like there was so much tea in Boston that got thrown in the harbor, and how there's so much, I guess that was the kind of ignition, the explosion point, the trigger point for all of this fighting, the Boston Tea Party, then the Boston Massacre, and then fighting with the soldiers that were occupying the city, is because Boston had become, an outpost of English and British independence and demand of natural rights and the things that they thought they had achieved in the English Civil War, being able to represent themselves in Parliament, no taxation without representation, and having courts, right, and being able to defend yourself, going right back to the Magna Carta. These are all English values, and they feel like the British Empire is taking them away, and that what we've got here is like a tyrant, a king like John, King John who signed the Magna Carta, or a king like Richard II, who put down the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, or a king like Charles who killed 10% of the population of England, trying to prove that he was the son chosen by God and the king by divine right, and they had to chop his head off. They already know these things. They know about the Reformation. They know about Henry VIII. So the people who are living in the colonies now for generations, they don't think that. They think, in a way, like they thought about Richard II, that this is not really the king doing it, but this is like Parliament and the government, the Royal British Imperial Government, doing these things to them. But after the protests and after the clashes start, they start to realize that, no, George is behind this, and George is part of the problem. So when they make the Declaration of Independence, and Thomas Paine writes this famous pamphlet called Common Sense, they're talking about, every line is like, he has done this, he has done this, he has taken away this, he is punishing us, he is bad, he is King George. Okay? So they go from wanting to reform, sort of like what happened with Martin Luther a little bit, wanting to reform the empire, the political system, to wanting to separate it and make it completely different. It's really what happened with the Catholic Church. There was lots of people who wanted to reform the Catholic Church, but as they realized the Catholic Church would never change, then they decided that they might have to split it and they might have to separate. So it just goes from complaining, like I said, from complaining to protesting to property damage to threats, to political movements, and it keeps going to violence, and then it ends up being a declaration of war by the colonies against the mother country. So let's talk about a couple people and read this short chapter over because it's important. Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin was the oldest. He's really a full generation older. A lot of these guys are pretty young. Jefferson is, I think, only 30 years old, or not even, much younger than me, when he writes the Constitution. So when they get these guys together, Benjamin Franklin, he is the senior politician. He's the most respected individual in the United States. He is a politician, he's a businessman, he's a writer, he's an inventor, he's a scientist, he speaks multiple languages. This guy's a genius. He's a polyglot. He's also part of the Royal Society of Science. And he's the first person from the colonies to be included. So this guy is like the highest status person you can get in America. He goes to England to try and negotiate some sort of compromise between what's going on in Philadelphia and Boston and New England and what's going on in the British Parliament. And he's amazed because he gets to go to the Parliament, and there's the King's palace is over there, and Westminster is here, and he's in the Parliament, and there's all these famous politicians. He's in, this historical and ancestral and political, the pinnacle of his society, right? The center of his civilization. So he's pretty impressed. And they bring him in, and he's in Parliament to be basically, I think he's expecting to have a little discussion, some back and forth, maybe make a presentation or something, or proposals. But instead, in front of everyone, the highest ranking political representatives just yell at him, chastise him, and threaten him, and say, "How you dare the colonists, the British colonists, behave like this towards the mother country, and how dare you break all these laws and threaten people, and sons of liberty destroying property and shooting tax collectors and people running away from them and not being able to. You're creating chaos. What's wrong with you? Have y'all lost your minds?" But he's talking to Benjamin Franklin like he's some kind of teenager who has done something wrong, like a miner who has stolen some cookies out of the cookie jar or something. They're just shaking their fan. This is my dramatization of it, but basically they insult him and threaten him, and they're so angry and unreasonable. He just sits there the whole time, maybe an hour or maybe two, and listens to them yell and doesn't say anything, and then leaves and goes back to America. But as soon as he leaves the Parliament, he's already realized that these people aren't going to give us any respect. They're not going to respect Benjamin Franklin, a person who would probably have 5 Nobel Prizes and be president multiple times, right? The kind of superhero type person, celebrity type person that all of you know, like Einstein or something like that. If they're not going to treat him well or respectfully, what are they going to do to the rest of the Americans? What do they think the rest of the Americans are if they think he's garbage? So he knows that it's inevitable. He wanted to reconcile. He wanted to remain British, but by the time he gets back to America, he's changed his mind. And once Benjamin Franklin changes his mind, a lot of people who are hesitating, don't really want to leave the British Empire, are like, well, if Benjamin Franklin thinks it's right, then I don't need to hesitate. He's smarter than me. So he made there was a huge political shift. And as soon as they started the war, they chose Benjamin Franklin to be the diplomatic representative of the new states, the new Congress to France. And even though France was in big trouble in terms of their alliances, their military's condition, their economy, their outdated political system, their king wasn't very popular. They were having constant problems with food and agriculture and everything, money problems. Even though they were in they had all those bad problems. I guess just the pure charm and the intelligence and persuasiveness of Benjamin Franklin, plus the fact the French really wanted to get revenge, probably, on the British military, after the Americans had won a few victories, which they were losing for the most part. So the French were hesitating, but once they won a couple victories, the French decided to support them, lend them money, and send ships. And a certain leader named Lafayette, he went and fought for General Washington, and that's why if you go around Eastern North America, the United States, you will see, even in Canada, you'll see Lafayette streets all over the place. They're named after one of the French aristocrats who believed in the revolution and went and fought for the Americans. So it was the American Revolution. The ideas of it were inspired by the French Revolution, but it happened first. So there's actually French revolutionaries who fought in America with the Americans and then went back and then fought in the French Revolution afterwards. Lafayette was one of them. I won't put Lafayette on the quiz. I just think he's a really interesting person. So read about Benjamin Franklin, really interesting person. You know the thing about the kite and electricity. George Washington was a general. He was one of the richest people in North America, even more wealthy than Benjamin Franklin. He was a slave owner, so there's a minus in my books. He did, when he died, free all his slaves, but for his entire life he was independently wealthy. He married a really rich woman who had more slaves than him, so he had hundreds of them. He never lived in the White House because he didn't need to, because he was rich. When they needed somebody to be the general of the Continental Army, the problem was the colonies didn't have any money, so they couldn't afford paying a general wage. But George Washington was like, well, I'm a pretty good general, and I'll do it for free. So the legend of Washington started there. He didn't win that many battles. The funny thing is he lost a bunch of battles, but he was brave, persistent, organized, charismatic, and relentless. He wouldn't give up. Doesn't matter how cold it was, or how many guns they had, or how many British they were fighting. He could always rally the troops. He almost got killed many times in battle, riding around on his horse, bullet holes through his shirt. His horse gets killed. Straps get shot off him. Bullets go through his hat. Somehow he doesn't. He's also lucky, like a Julius Caesar type person. So George Washington, his soldiers believed. He was very charismatic. No matter how hard the situation was, his soldiers, even if they weren't paid on time and they're cold and hungry, he found a way to get the soldiers, these British colonists who were going to be Americans, he inspired them. That was his talent, I think. I'm not a military historian, I'm not American, so take that with a grain of salt, but that's how I see his genius. He definitely was a genius of a leader, but he was no Napoleon. His tactics and strategics were not his strong point. But he was a very good politician, as it turned out, and he was a very good leader, and he could keep the morale of his troops high in almost any condition, which is one of the most important things you need. You just need your army to believe in you and keep fighting. They say he never told a lie, but he did sometimes. And he also didn't like to say bad words, but sometimes he got pretty angry. So occasionally there is evidence that But if George Washington cursed at you, that meant you're in big trouble, because he wouldn't curse no matter how angry he was, unless he was ready to really like strangle somebody. So normally he was pretty calm. What happened after the American Revolution? We got to talk about this a little bit more in detail. But basically, the American colonies didn't really get as much as they wanted. What they really wanted to do is expand westward and not worry about the treaties and the tribes and civilizations and people of the natives, which the British Empire had told them that to stop expanding westward. That was one of the things that made them angry, along with all the taxes. But they wanted the freedom to expand and to develop the country the way they saw fit, and not to pay taxes to a country or a ruling body far away. So those were several of the factors that made them decide to fight for their independence. But once they got their independence, they found like everything wasn't that much different. I mean, now they had a country, and the British weren't paying for their army, and they weren't paying for anything. Like they weren't paying for their roads or maintenance of things, or their messengers or the government officials. So all of a sudden, all of these 13 colonies who wanted to be independent and free kind of all had to stick together and start paying for everything. So then all of a sudden the opposite of what happened before. It's like the 13 colonies had their own way of doing everything, but now they all had to agree. But they had problems doing that because they were very different. That was one of the reasons the British thought that they would never actually be able to make an army and make a country and fight back, because the colonies were so different. Georgia, even now, if you go to Georgia and you go to New York City, you're not going to think it's the same country. They speak English, but vastly different cultural experiences, environmental, surroundings, and I mean, a Georgian accent and a New York accent is very, very different. It's like somebody from Gangwon-do going down to Jeju and having a conversation. They might not even understand each other. Who knows? But these colonies have vastly different economies, they're different sizes, they have different. So you have to try and make all of this into one country. It's kind of a miracle. It does happen, but I'm not going to go through all the details right now. I just want to talk about one particular thing, because one of the major issues is, like I said on the board here, I told you before, they're making a republic here. So it's not a pure democracy. Only wealthy white people get to vote. And they vote for these people called electors. And these electors vote for the president. So it's not surprising that Washington got all the votes, because just all the electors voted. Not all the people, not the millions of people that are living in America, but just all the representatives chosen by the only people who can vote. So the franchise is very, very small, but it's still voting. But we're talking about like 1% of the population here. Very narrow franchise. Okay? So it's a republic. It's not a democracy, right? If you're a slave, or you're native, or you're a black person, or you're not, or you're a woman, if you're anything except for a white person, if you're a poor white person, you don't even count. You gotta have enough wealth to register to vote. Then you can vote. Otherwise, you're a slave, or you're a servant, or you're lower class, and you're just a piece in the vast machine of capitalism and globalism and imperialism and slavery that keeps all these wealthy people who can vote wealthy, keeps them in their place, in their class. There is social mobility, I told you. Sometimes Black Death comes and kills half the people, and then you get people moving around. But for the most part, you're going to see that, especially in the South, people who had more money pass on that money to their children, and they have more money and more land, and they buy more slaves, and then it's almost like a society, it's a social system based on aristocrats taking advantages of slaves, like ancient Rome. The movement towards democracy is going to be slow. The revolution happens, there's no more king, okay? So there's no more king. They made it that far. They wrote the Declaration of Independence. They're using words like everybody has natural rights and inalienable rights, like all rights are given to you just by being alive. They're not, you don't have to earn them, you just have them. But then in practice, that's not what happened. So gradually these things in the Constitution that seem like sort of ambiguous ideas that might actually suggest equality for everyone, if they're interpreted the right way, get interpreted in the wrong way and reinforce this division. So there'll be court cases and stuff where they'll say, okay, all human beings have rights to be free, right? Life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. But African Americans are not people, right? They don't count. Things like that. Like you change the definition of what a human being is, which this is obviously a huge contributor to racism. You've got legal means of discriminating against different people, especially people who are slaves, whatever color they are, but mostly African American. You get these ways to discriminate: legal, political, and then even later we'll talk about the 19th century where they start to use science to try and prove that there is differences in races scientifically, and that there's a scientific basis for superiority in certain groups of people. Okay, so all of these things you're going to have to read this, and we're going to have to talk about it a bit more. But I want you to read to the end of the chapter. There's not too much to read from what I talked about today. Thomas Jefferson is the last of the three Jefferson that I'm going to mention. He's the one who wrote the Constitution. Don't forget that. He was a lawyer. Jefferson and Washington owned slaves. Franklin is the old grandpa who was he was a genius, okay? Thomas Jefferson and Washington both became president. Washington was a general. Jefferson was a slave-owning lawyer, okay? Jefferson will be one of the great drivers of a certain type of Republican behavior, which we will have to talk about after the quiz because I don't want things to get mixed up. But there's a lot of contradictions here, and hang on to that word contradiction because that'll be important for your next assignment. So I hope this lecture fills things out for the rest of the chapter. Please read and highlight things that are related to what I talked about, and you should be fine. Like this short chapter, like I said, make sure you know the main points about each section, and we'll do the third quiz on Friday, and we'll go from there. Then we'll be talking about the 19th century all of a sudden. So have a good day. See you Friday. Don't be late. 11 o'clock. You got to be there in person. Be ready.